It's a morning in the summer of 2008. You're in the swing of summer break enjoying some time on the family gateway computer. You go to Miniclip, you launch your favorite game, RuneScape, when your phone buzzes and you flip it open. What? The RuneScape website had just been updated and your friend happened to see something that he shouldn't. A new skill. Sailing. At least, that's what everyone thought. This image right here blew up at the time, sending the community into a frenzy, hunting for any sign to confirm the new skill. Sadly, Mod Dave came out on the forums pretty quickly to give us all the truth. The image wasn't real. It was a joke played on Mr. Fangallo, also known as Baby Bear OSRS, by a friend of his, but this is where sailing started. Now, since this initial joke, there was always folks in the community hunting for proof of sailing, but things were pretty quiet on the sailing front for many years after this, while other skills were in development, such as dungeoneering and summoning. We did get a small teaser in the April Fool's post in 2011, sandwiched between everything else, one word, sailing. But that was pretty much it from an official capacity for a while. Of course, over the years, RuneScape itself went through many controversial changes, which eventually led to a vote in early 2013 to release another version of the game, a more nostalgic version of the game, now called Old School RuneScape. And while this isn't quite where our sailing story picks back up, it is important to note Old School was born of a poll, and as part of its release would also be including an in-game poll system to vote on changes or future updates, where everything polled required a 75% threshold in order to continue through development for later release. This will impact sailing in a number of ways, but more on that later. Fast forward a year to April 1st, 2014. Folks at Jagex must have really loved the old meme because lo and behold, they put sailing into the game. Players logged in on the morning of April 1st to find boats off the shore of Draenor Village. You could speak to the NPC here and he'd let you quote-unquote sail to an island, see a little quip from a different NPC, and then you'd quickly come back. Each trip would even grant you XP, allowing you to level the skill, though it would reset around level 20. Obviously, this was a joke, but this ignited a passion for adding a new skill to Old School. People absolutely loved this. So, the team got hard to work in designing a skill pitch, but it wouldn't be sailing. Yet. Shortly after this whole thing, in the summer of 2014, the team presented the Artisan skill, often referred to as the Slayer of Skilling. You'd be able to get a task to either gather a resource or create some items, and then in turn, that would grant XP and rewards. As you leveled up this skill, it would give different skilling quality of lifestyle perks, like something to store bowstring, an ability to save burnt food, an equipable item for storing various skilling tools, etc. Ultimately, though, this skill failed the poll at a rough 56.5%, nearly 20% below the passing threshold. All of the related rewards failed alongside it, but something interesting you'll notice about anything the team works on, even if it fails, parts of whatever failed will live on either in future skills or as individual releases, such as Redwood Logs and Quartz, which later turned into Amethyst from this Artisan pitch. While Artisan failed, there was still a hunger for a new skill, so the team tried again a year later in 2015, and this time was the one we've all been waiting for, sailing. After the initial announcement, the team put out an official trailer, and just look at some of the stuff that they had in here. Fighting krakens, meeting mermaids, exploring Atlantis, diving for sunken treasure. I mean, they were really shooting for the moon here. At this time, the team was quite small, and there was much less to the pitch from what we've come to expect today, but even with that, there was mention of things like navigation that felt similar to the way that you move your character on land, having multiple ships, having a crew, improving your cannons, upgrading your hull, things like that. There's actually a ton in here that sounds really familiar to the sailing of today. But before I get ahead of myself, this iteration of sailing, for better or for worse, failed. 67.9%, just around 8% below the passing threshold. However, that is actually quite a bit better than how Artisan fared just a year earlier, at that 56.5%. This is a really strong signal for a new skill, and not all was lost, as many of the rewards from this pitch also made it into Old School over the following few years. Things like Zenites, the Augury and Rigger Prayers, Fossil Island, and a bunch of other stuff. But with another failed skill pitch, the team was ready to switch focus to adding content in other areas of the game. Now, from late 2015 to 2018, we got a ton of stuff like Zaya, our first raid, our second raid, the Inferno, Hardcore Iron Man, a Dead Man Mode tournament, 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 a Dead Man Mode tournament. Sorry about that. I think the tape got stuck for a bit there. Golly. Jeez. We had so many Dead Man Mode tournaments for a few years. Like, it's actually crazy to think about it now. But it is now October 2018. RuneFest is in full swing, and the development team is ready to announce another skill pitch, warding. Now, it took a few months for us to get more information, but warding was essentially what smithing and fletching are for melee and range. That is to say, it was the method for crafting magical armors and enhancements. At the time, magic was pretty lackluster in terms of progression, essentially going from mystics to Arims to ancestral, which are some pretty big gaps. The team spent a ton of time trying to make it feel integrated with the world, making sure that it really felt old school in nature, and personally, I think they nailed that fact. The problem is, as a skill, it really wasn't exciting. If you just look at the skills it was trying to be adjacent to, smithing and fletching, those aren't exactly the most exciting skills either. So when it was polled in July of 2019, it failed at 66.4%, still a good 9% below that passing threshold, and even 1.5% worse than that sailing pitch back in 2015. Ouch. As with other failed skills, we actually did get many of the rewards, such as the Abyssal Lantern, the Colossal Rune Essence Pouch, an upgrade to the Rune Pouch, some of the armors like Bloodbark and Dagonhai, among other things. All that said, it was time for another quiet period for skill pitches. Now, between late 2019 and 2022, there was a growing conversation around whether the 75% voting threshold in the polls should be reduced. The theory behind this was not many players would even vote in any given poll, which meant the higher the passing threshold was, the easier it was for a small group of players to deny updates. You can think about it this way. If 10% of the players show up and decide to vote in a poll, only 2.5% of the game's population had to say no for an update to fail. Now, at the time, it was hard to say exactly how much of an impact this would have on the integrity of the game, considering Jagex could always make, quote, integrity changes without the polling system, and they had done so previously. At the end of the day, though, in October of 2022, they pulled the trigger and reduced the passing threshold from 75% to 70% for old school polls. Keep in mind, none of the previous skill pitches would have been impacted by this, but we're coming up to a big moment where this does matter. At the Winter Summit, just a few months later, the team was ready to try again with the skill pitch, but this time, they wanted to take a new approach. Now, you can see it here. In breaking it up this way, it meant rather than voting on a skill pitch, we'd get a vote at every step along the way, whether or not the developers would proceed further into this process. The goal with this was to make an efficient use of time, starting with the most important question, do you want a new skill? And even with the new voting threshold, the community resoundingly said yes at 80.9%. And with that yes, in January of 2023, that kicked us off into this community consultation phase. This is where Jagex would work with the community to define what sort of new skills should come into the game. There were heaps and heaps of ideas within the community. Two of my personal favorites were exploration and barding. I just love the effort that people in the community put in to create stuff like this. I'll have links for each of the Reddit posts down below if you want to check them out yourself, because they are great reads. So this phase was a lot of fun. A lot of ideas were thrown around, and it continued for a few months until March of 2023, where the development team took all of the best ideas from these beloved community posts and tied them into 3 competing skills. The first was shamanism, which would be a sort of like gathering and production skill focused on interacting with the spirit world to create interesting new items or power up existing ones. The second was taming, which was, well, farming with animals, really. Does anybody want a pet dragon? And of course, the third and final skill of the bunch, sailing. After nearly 8 years making its return to the spotlight. And much like everything else in Old School, it was put to a poll, but this one was a bit different. They set it up with 2 questions. The first, you could select any of the skills you'd like added to the game. Sailing was the top skill in this question by a mere 500 votes, but keep in mind, people could select more than one here. I myself went for both sailing and shamanism, and looking at the results, it's safe to say these two were the community favorites as well. The second question was to help clear up a winner. Which skill is your favorite? And for this question, you could only pick one option, and this is really the question where sailing won the vote. It had a 3% lead above any of the other options. Yes, not a huge margin by any means, but sizable enough. However, you'll notice this poll didn't have anything to do with that 70% threshold, and you're right. This vote just helped us move forward in that new process to the refinement stage. Things were fairly quiet for the following few months while the team worked on refining the sailing pitch. They knew for a skill to have any hope of being approved by the community that it needed to be really fleshed out before getting in front of people in the polls. During this phase, they hashed out the core systems for training and playing the skill, how navigating and the world map would work, some loose reward concepts, and how they would integrate the skill into the wider game so it didn't just feel like it was slapped on the side with duct tape. For those who wanted to be more involved in this process, they set up a dedicated sailing Discord channel and would have modcasts for each stage, some of which we got multiple for. This also gave you a channel where you could provide feedback directly to the team about these different topics as they were working their way through them. But it can only be refined for so long without putting it to a vote. Following the Summer Summit in August of 2023, we got the question, should sailing be added as Old School RuneScape's first new skill? Now, before I show you the results, I have to tell you, Jagex caught some flack for this question. Unlike previous skill pitches, which had a dedicated poll going over both the skill and the related methods and rewards, this was just one question. Not only that, it was one question sandwiched in the middle of all the other items that were talked about at the Summer Summit. Things like Varlamore, the Path of Glofrey quest, improving Chambers of Zarek, and some other things as well. Like, I think it's some fair criticism here that Jagex really buried the lead on this one. And it was made worse by the fact that, well, you remember about 8 months ago when they lowered the passing threshold from 75% to 70%? Yeah, sailing passed at 71.9%. Talk about a bit of a close call there. This did spawn a lot of conspiracy theories that the threshold was lowered to make sailing pass. I think given the timeline, that's just not true. This is also the highest percentage we've seen on any of the skill pitches over the years, for what that's worth. Of course, that didn't dissuade anyone from pointing fingers, and fair. I mean, this particular question certainly could have been handled better. You know, it's funny. This created so much controversy in the community, both from people who preferred the other skill pitches and from people who didn't want a new skill, that Jagex felt the need to put out a few poll result graphs to try and like bring people together. And I mean, just look at these. I feel like when you get to this point, you just stick to your guns. Like, I can't imagine that this convinced anyone who wasn't already okay with moving forward with sailing. But I digress. Whether you agree or not, we're living in the timeline where sailing passed, so development would carry forward. In January of 2024, we got this rough sailing timeline, and then things went quiet for a few months while some of the back-end work was done. Next thing we heard about sailing was in May of 2024, where we got the technical demo. While it wasn't exactly visually impressive, this was a big step in showing it was actually possible. I remember a lot of people being worried the game just couldn't do sailing, and I think this demo really helped prove otherwise for a lot of folks. But things again would be pretty quiet for a while, unless you were one of the lucky few near Jagex HQ who got to go in for playtesting in August of 2024. For the rest of us, we wouldn't really hear anything about sailing until March of 2025. It was here at RuneFest that they had an alpha prepared. For anyone that was able to attend RuneFest at the time, they got to play the alpha at the event, which is pretty cool. And just about a week later, they released sailing in open alpha to the entire player base. Considering how quiet things had been on the sailing front, I think for many this is when it became real. The alpha included the ability to get 2 boats, upgrade some different pieces of it, sail around in this area of the sea, and interact with all kinds of different things. We even had a cool completionist style checklist thing for anybody who wanted to go hard during the alpha. I think I personally spent around 20 hours messing around on the high seas. Now, a lot of folks did complain at the time about a lack of content here, but the majority of the community seemed to react very positively to this alpha event. It's something about being able to just sail into the open seas just captured people's imagination. And after this alpha event is really when our timeline starts to pick up. In June, we got our first big content poll, and everything passed. They also reran what was essentially the alpha, but with more polished backend systems in place. In August, we got our second big content poll, along with some server stress testing. And again, everything in the poll passed. And then in October, we got our final content poll. Everything passed again. And we got the official announcement for Sailing's launch date, November 19th, 2025. And that brings us up to today. The Sailing skill, which started as some spoofed up screenshot between friends back in 2008, is now a full-fledged skill in Old School RuneScape. We've got navigating the high seas with different types of boats, crew members you can recruit, ships you can salvage, different tiers of cannonballs to fire, islands to explore. I mean, man, you name it. There is so much to talk about with this skill, all the different activities you can do with it, how the launch has been received, major issues that came with it, how a new skill in 2025 is impacting the game's economy, and I will talk about it in this video here. I hope you've enjoyed this little jaunt down memory lane. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you there.